This morning's panel is called Populism and Governance in the Time of Pandemic. I thank very much to all of you for your participation. In this panel, we have two speakers. The first one is Dr. Manuel Funke. I hope I pronounced correctly your last name. And our second speaker is Dr. Aline Burni. I still hope that I pronounced correctly your last name. Yes, thank you very much. The first speaker is Dr. Manuel Funke. He will present a speech called Populist Leaders, the Economy and the Pandemic. What can we expect? Yes, Dr. Manuel Funke, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. You have 20 minutes for the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Professor Karakas. I hope I pronounced the name correctly.
Yeah, perfectly.
Maybe I start by sharing my screen to you all. I hope this works. Do you see it?
Yes.
All right. So my talk today is called Populist Leaders, the Economy and the Pandemic. What can we expect? And basically, as I am working for the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, my talk will have a special focus on the economy, but I will also touch upon the pandemic in the second part of the presentation. In the part on the economy, I will present my own research, and in the part on the pandemic, I will refer to research that was conducted within our institute and by members of my research team. So I just want to stress that before I start. But first of all, I have to apologize that I couldn't attend the first keynote speech. So I don't know in how far you have already discussed what populism is and maybe how we can measure it, because that will be the starting point of my talk. And yeah, the last part will sort of bring the economy and the pandemic under populist leadership sort of together and conclude. So yeah, we lack still, I mean, I appreciate these initiatives that we have like a whole research center dealing exclusively with populism, and that we have journals like emerging that are called Populism or Populism and Politics. I mean, this is amazing, but still we are lacking knowledge on populism and especially on populists in power. So we have heard a little bit about it also in by Mark Findlay, that he talked about the anxiety and the climate crisis and the financial crisis as a determinant of populism. But there's not so much work yet on the consequences of populists in power. And that is what I want to focus on today, because I think that's the way to proceed and to go forward within this research area of populism. First of all, one could say that, like, examining the literature, that over the past 2 decades, there has emerged sort of a consensus or minimal definition of populism, and that is that populism is mainly defined as a political strategy or as a political style, not so much as a thick ideology, but more like a rhetoric, like a style, like a strategy. And at the very core of the strategy is the struggle of the people versus the elites. The populists claims to represent the pure people, the good people, the honest people, and these people are inherently in opposition to a corrupt elite. And the role of the populist is to defend this good people from this evil elite. And this theme sort of penetrates the populist discourse from beginning to the end. So in the campaign and also when the populist is in power. And then populism can adapt to like a thicker ideology, left-wing ideology, meaning the populist campaigns against financial and economic elites and for redistribution, so giving money from the rich elites to the poor people. Or the populist is on the right-wing political side, and that means the criticism of the elite is cultural, and the main critique is that the elite protects, the political elite protects ethnic, religious minorities and foreigners at the expense of the native population. So populism can sort of assume these two faces, the left wing and the right wing. And I want to now briefly present a research paper that I've written together with Moritz Schularek of Bonn and Christoph Trebesch, also from Kiel Institute. And this paper is called Populist Leaders and the Economy. And in this paper, we classify like 1,500 leaders either as populist or non-populist, and as right-wing and as left-wing. And our data set covers 60 countries and 120 years. And how do we arrive at the final classification of who is a populist and who is not a populist? We fortunately can make use of the huge literature that has emerged and that also very often has a historical focus. And so we collected basically from Google Scholar and main research publication databases, all articles that have populism or populist in the title. And then we made this machine readable and then scanned the names of all independent country leaders since 1900. So presidents and prime ministers. And then we extracted those parts of the sources where the leader is described by the populism expert who has written the paper. And then we decided if the leader fits, the description of the leader fits the definition of populism that I've outlined earlier. And we disregard borderline cases, but we only include clear-cut cases of populism. And this way we find 50 clear-cut populist leaders. And we then plotted the share of countries that were governed by a leader that is classified as a populist in the political science literature. The share of countries where this was the case in all countries, independent countries that were in our sample in each year. And we can see that populism had hit its high times also in the interwar period and also from the 50s to the 70s, mostly in Latin America. And since the year 2000, roughly, we see like a secular increase in the share of countries worldwide that are governed by populists. And this is mainly due to more right-wing populism and also outside of Latin America, more in Europe and Western countries. As an example, I show here a list of populists in power for the year 2018. I mean, this is obviously our way to code it, our way to proceed. This is up to debate, especially if you present that in front of an international audience. There often like listeners will like mention specific cases from their countries where they disagree or not, and so on and so forth. But this is what we come up with, and this is what we use for the for further analysis. And one key result is that populist leaders often rule for many years. So the average time of populists in office is about 7.5 years or 8 years, compared to 4 years for non-populist leaders. So populists are persistent in relative terms. And also they have a high re-election probability. So over 30% of the populist leaders in our sample have returned to office. And for non-populist leaders, the return probability is only half in size. And here you can also see that populism at the federal level or government level is serious. So we have this long and repeating spells of populist leadership that we can observe in many countries, not all of them, but for some countries, this really stands out as a pattern. And our idea then, because we are economists, was to use this sample of populists here and to estimate how the economy develops when these leaders are in power. So after these leaders have come to power. And this is what I will now explain in more detail in the second part. So we used the coded sample of populist leaders to study the economic consequences of populism. And our focus was basically on these topics that populists often, as representatives of the people, they often like pander to the people and make campaign promises and promise to better the situation of the average citizen. So their focus is on income distribution, on inequality, on consumption, on income per capita. But also we hear from the political science literature that often, and this is, I think, also a core topic of this conference, populists pursue politics in the area of economic nationalism, protectionism, often overspending or huge debt is involved, and also the erosion of checks and balances under populists is a problem. So these may be channels through which populist governments could affect the development of the economies, looking at growth literature, so determinants of growth. I will not talk too much about like the specific methodologies that we use, but just as a start, what we first did was we looked at the 15 years after which the populists came to power and then simply estimated whether there was a growth gap. So a gap in the performance of the economy of the country compared to the long run average performance of the country. And what we found was that we found an almost 1 percentage point negative GDP growth gap. So there's an output loss that is associated with populism. And we then also use a little bit more rigorous methodologies. So panel fixed effects regressions, you would call that, an econometrician would call that panel fixed effects regression, and our results remained robust to this. So there is some indication that economies suffer from populist governance. But we cannot be sure if we look at one specific country and compare it to the long run average of the country, or for example, if you compare Germany to all other European Union countries, or only to Austria, you don't know if the economy of Austria or the European economy is a good counterfactual for the German economy. So what we did was we construct synthetic so-called doppelganger economies. That is, you take a weighted average of economies that have a path similar to the treated economy at the time when the populist comes to power. So this allows for a more rigorous comparison between the populist economy and a counterfactual. So you assume, for example, that, or let me put it this way, the emergence of populism is often connected, for example, to economic crisis or financial crisis. And this algorithm that we use here makes it sure that the economies to which we compare the populist country also experienced such crisis before the new government came to power. And one way to show this is to plot the GDP growth 30 years around, say, Berlusconi came to power in Italy in 2001. And this would then span the years from 1985 to 2015. And you can see that the solid line here is the average for the populist economies, and the dotted line here is the average for these synthetic economies that we have created. And we can see clearly that there is a gap between these two economies. This is maybe a better way to show this. So there's a 10 percentage point loss under populist governments compared to non-populist governments in the 15 years after these governments come to power. And then we use the same empirical approach also for potential channels of populist policies. And we also found that there is, to a certain degree, an increase in protectionism under populists. So the import tariffs increase by about 10 percentage points. This is large compared to, like, the sample average was 15% in tariffs. Also, the ratio of debt to GDP increases, so there's more government debt under populist politicians. And which is, in my opinion, the most relevant channel or most interesting channel is that institutions erode. As an example, take an index on the constraints on the judicial constraints on the executive. You can also see that this index really declines from year 0 to year 10 strongly. And we've seen countless examples of this attacks on the judiciary, and also we made the same estimations for press freedom and also for electoral freedom, and we also found that all these institutional indicators systematically decline under populist governments. Now, I am not an expert on, in general, on maybe I don't know if I'm maybe wrong here, but I have so far not conducted any research on the pandemic, because the focus of my research is historical, and I'm kind of like shy away from like analyzing an ongoing event. But I will present research by Michael Bayerlein. He is from my institute, and he has papers on the impact of COVID on populism, will it be weakened, and also how populist governments mishandle the pandemic. And why I chose this paper here is because the approach is similar to what we have estimated for the populist economies. So they use a comparable statistical approach, but they study if populist governments perform differently in terms of a variety of measures related to the management of the pandemic. So their sample is smaller. They only look at at 2020. And they only feature 11 populist governments, comparing them to 42 non-populist governments. And first of all, what they find is that there was an initial, this graphic here shows from polling data, the change in government support. So this, in Germany, it's called the Sunday question. Would you support the current government right now? So this is survey data evaluated. And you can see that just after COVID arrived, so initially populists suffered voter support in the few days just after the pandemic started. And one possible reaction, which they also outline in their paper, is that populists then took a different course than other governments in terms of fighting this pandemic. They used data on here, particularly this COVID-19 government response tracker by the Oxford University. This tracks the degree of measures by governments taken to get the pandemic under control, meaning lockdowns, vaccination, masks, mandatory masks, and the like. And they, in this graphic, they, like we did with the GDP growth or the economy, they here compare populist governments to non-populist governments in terms of how strong were the containment measures. And they find that over the year 2020, there was a significantly larger effort by non-populist governments to undertake containment measures compared to populist governments. Here the green lines are populist governments, and this red line here or gray line above are all other governments. So this was maybe the reaction by populists for the initial uncertainty among voters to take a different path concerning pandemic management, and maybe a path that was not so strict or restrictive as non-populist conventional governments would have went. And in their paper, they present kind of they propose that one outcome of this loser pandemic management could be that excess mortality in 2020 under populists, here the green line, increased compared to non-populist governments, and by the end of 2020 it was twice as high as in non-populist countries. To conclude, the first part, the key takeaway of the first part is that populism tends to be bad economics. So, I mean, this study was explorative, and this is not an ultimate truth that I present, but in the majority of cases, compared to a plausible counterfactual, we see that there is a decline in real GDP per capita. We also see that populists typically enact policies of economic protectionism. We also see that government debt, public debt levels increase systematically under populist governments. And we see that a range of institutional strength, institutional quality measures go down the drain when populists come to power. And this may be also one of the channels, not only because we know that institutions, functioning institutions, are key for innovation, for education, for growth of an economy. So this could be an important channel why economies on balance suffer under populist governance. But this also could be an explanation of why maybe despite the economy suffers, voters or populists still manage to be in power for long periods of time. Precisely because they erode certain checks and balances that are meant to monitor and control them. And on the second part, the pandemic, we have seen from the paper by Bayerlein et al. That countries governed by populists experience higher excess mortality than conventional countries. We have also seen that initially populist governments lost voter support. And in the following, this is like my interpretation of it, is that these governments, the policy response in general of these governments might have been a little bit more opportunistic and up to inadequate compared to other countries. And also there is this permanent discussion about, or this topic of misinformation, of downplaying, and also of anti-science opinions, or that populists often raise, and this could also somehow in the end result to this increased excess mortality that they have found in their paper. But this is obviously something that is up to debate. In general, my takeaway would be that, I mean, we don't have to forget, like, managing a twin crisis of the economy and public health with multiple trade overs and multiple spillovers. I mean, even we as scientists cannot, like right now, get the full picture of the multiple thousands, millions of effects at work. This is demanding, but it could be even more demanding for populist governments who often propose simple solutions to complex problems, and also very like easy truths that are easy to transport to the people. So I think managing such a pandemic and such an economic crisis requires a lot of expertise, patience, trust, and all of this. And I think that populist governments are maybe not the best candidates to like show these skills at the moment. I can say that from the research that I've conducted myself and that I've read, and for like the years to come, the question will be if populists, despite their maybe problems in the management of crisis and of the pandemic, will still somehow not suffer too much from it, because this rally around the flag effect and this focus on my country first, my nation first, or my family first, maybe will, if many people return to this dogma, this will help populists disregarding how the country then really develops. Or the other opportunity is, or the other possibility is that these populist governments will simply be punished in the end by the voters for the economic and public health related performance of their countries. We will see that in the years to come. Thanks a lot.
We thank you very much, Dr. Manuel Funke. Dr. Manuel Funke is from Kiel Institute for the World Economy. The research area is international finance and macroeconomics.
True.
We thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Funke.
I thank you for the invitation.
Now, the floor is to Dr. Aline Burni. Aline Burni, she's a political scientist from German Development Institute. Yes, Dr. Aline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Karakas. Can you see my presentation?
I see your presentation.
Okay, great. So I would also like to start by thanking you and the organizers for the invitation.
You have 20 minutes, Dr. Aline, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I will bring a perspective from political science, and I must say that I'm focusing on what we can expect for the future, and I will base it on some recent results of populists in elections and popularity indicators, but I have not conducted very systematic and consistent and forward and longer term research as Funke presented himself. I have conducted research on the case of Brazil, and we found evidence that President Bolsonaro had a significant effect on people's behavior and how people, his supporters in particular, did not follow the health recommendations in reaction to the denialist signals by Bolsonaro. But this is not what I'm focusing today. I will focus on a more comparative and broader perspective, trying to look forward. So much has been said about the pandemic bringing an end to populism, right? However, I agree with other scholars on populism that this claim is too strong to be held, and it is also too early to reach this conclusion because the pandemic is still ongoing. Furthermore, I think it's particularly important to differentiate between what we can expect in the short term and in the long term. We can also expect a different impact of the pandemic across different regions and for different countries as well. And the impact of the pandemic on populism should also be different for those who are in power and in opposition. So my focus will mainly be on what we call the populist radical right parties in Europe, but I will also mention some examples from other countries. Indeed, and as the previous talk has provided us with some insights, some populists in power, they have lost popularity in the context of the pandemic, and this is probably linked to the way that they manage the crisis. There is already some evidence showing that these leaders have been less effective in managing the pandemic, at least when compared to non-populists. But these studies, they tend to focus on cases beyond Europe and generalize from these cases, and they focus on the first wave of the pandemic. So we should be careful on saying that populism itself will be over after the pandemic because of this mismanagement. Actually, not all populists have responded the same way, and the impact of COVID does not seem to be homogeneous on them either. It is also relevant to take into account that in Europe, most populists are in opposition. So when it comes to expectations about the impact of the pandemic in the long term, I believe we can rely on existing studies on populism and the factors that help explain why it emerges. We should look into the root causes and the longer term causes of populism to try to understand what we can expect in the future. These explanations, they usually focus on supply side and demand side factors. And I believe that there are factors in both approaches that can contribute to the resilience of populism in the long term. Therefore, in a nutshell, I do not think that populism will be defeated by the pandemic. The literature points out that in general, crises benefit populists, right? However, when you first look at the impact of this pandemic, at least for populists in government, they seem to have lost some popularity with the rise of COVID deaths, more than non-populist governments. And this is shown in one interesting study by Brett Meyer, who is also a panelist in this symposium. And in addition, we saw that some populist leaders that were in government in the pandemic, they lost elections. So notably the case of Trump in the US. However, in opposition, populist parties have kind of stabilized, or they only lost marginal support. For instance, the AfD in Germany went from about 13% from the last elections in 2017, and now they gathered 10% in 2021. So as has been discussed by the scholarship, at first, it seems very difficult for populists to capitalize on the COVID crisis. And why is that? Basically, because it is very hard for them to mobilize against governments and the political establishment during a pandemic. It is challenging to politicize a health crisis and to criticize governments who are experiencing a rally around the flag effect. And it is also hard to work under this logic of people versus the elite, especially when citizens tend to rely on and to trust on expert knowledge to overcome the health outbreak. In addition, there is little room for the salience of populist preferred topics during the pandemic, like immigration and national identity. And the bad performance of prototypical populist leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro have exposed their unpreparedness to deal with such a crisis. So let's start by looking to some recent numbers. When we look to some recent electoral results or polls in Europe, we can see that there's not a clear decreasing support for populist radical right parties. They have lost some support in some cases in the latest elections, for instance, in Germany and in Norway. And according to the polls, they are expected to lose some support in Poland, in Denmark, and France. I'll go back to France in a while. However, they have gained support in other cases, like in Portugal, where this new party, Chega, went from only 1 MP to 12 between 2 elections. And according to the polls, we can expect significant rises in Italy and Belgium, where the parties are ranking first, as well as more modest ones in Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. In the latest elections in the Netherlands, we saw one right-wing populist party lose some support and another one gaining some. So the overall balance stays the same. And finally, these parties seem to have been more or less stable in Finland, in Greece, and in Hungary. So even in apparent cases of loss, like in France, we need to be cautious to interpret this as a result or as an impact of the pandemic itself. In the case of France, as you know, the traditional populist radical right party led by Marine Le Pen, the Rassemblement National, is now facing another competitor who is in the same camp of Marine Le Pen. So Éric Zemmour, he is recently gathering around 14% of the vote intentions. So in this case, if we were to sum up the expected support that these two candidates are likely to receive in the next presidential elections, according to the polls, we can actually say that the demand for populism has kind of increased in France, and it's now reaching more than 30% of the electorate. Therefore, we see that in cases like this, like France, Italy, and the Netherlands, while support for one more traditional or more established populist radical right party slightly decreased, there are more offers appearing or consolidating in the same side of the ideological spectrum. So this means that overall, we see a stable or even an increased demand for populism in some cases. Now, when it comes to populists in government, they have not faced a homogeneous situation either. It is not clear that the pandemic has consistently weakened their basis. So as I said, Meyer conducted this interesting study about populist leaders in government in Europe and argued that populist-led governments were more likely to be punished by the electorate for the rising of COVID deaths. Nevertheless, when we look beyond Europe, we can remember that even if Trump lost the elections in 2020, he actually increased his popular votes. Trump won more than 70,000 million votes, which is more votes than any other presidential candidate has ever won, with the exception of Biden, of course. So this clearly shows that if Trump lost the election, Trumpism itself is not dead. Similarly, in Brazil, Bolsonaro lost significant popularity during the pandemic. However, despite his consistent denialist approach to the virus and now to the vaccines, he still holds around 30% of positive approvals of his government. And he is expected to run the second round of the upcoming presidential elections in October this year. So in the case of Brazil, we clearly see that Bolsonaro lost some support from the general public, but he clearly maintained his support in his core bases. In India, a similar recent opinion poll revealed that 72% of Indians still want to see Modi as their prime minister in 2024. Therefore, I would say that in a way, populists in government have been resilient despite their mismanagement of the pandemic, at least in these prototypical cases. And in addition to that, going back to Europe, in this recent paper written by Wonders and Moode, they emphasize then that in Europe, it is not clear that these two most pure far-right populist regimes of Hungary and Poland, they actually manage the pandemic very differently or worse than other EU governments. So having looked at these recent trends in popularity, I now would like to go back to some of the key findings of studies on populism that explain the rise and the drivers of populism. And I argue that there are reasons to believe that populism will not end based on the explanations about populism. And this is because some of these explaining factors of populism will likely remain in place even after the pandemic. So it is, of course, hard to make predictions about the future, And I could be wrong, but I think that the pandemic will most likely not bring an end to populism, because some root causes or longer term causes of populism will largely remain in place. And some issues generated or even aggravated by the pandemic, such as job insecurity and rising inequality, they could activate populist support in the future again. So as I said, we need to distinguish between the short-term impact and the longer-term impact of the pandemic. And in the short term, it is true that the pandemic does not seem to favor the popularity of populists. Nevertheless, at least in Europe, as we have seen, where most populists are in opposition, there is not a drastic and clear negative effect of the pandemic either. And on the long run, we could think that populism could rise again based on what the literature says about populism. So first, crises in general help foster support for populists. Both the immigration crisis and the financial crisis have helped populists thrive in Europe, for instance. And the pandemic will likely aggravate some economic and political crises. In fact, some prospects regarding the economy already point to an increasing pressure of inflation, reduction of GDP growth in many countries, rising income inequality, and shocks in the job markets. So beyond this economic crisis itself, in the case of Latin America, for instance, political crisis and corruption scandals usually contribute to the rise of populists. And in the context of the pandemic, corruption has been on the rise in Latin America during the pandemic. Therefore, even if it is difficult for populists to exploit the health crisis itself, this does not mean that they will not find ways to explore new discursive opportunities opened up by economic crisis and political crisis left by the pandemic. Second, and particularly in Europe, the immigration issue will likely return to the agenda at some point. While people's attitudes towards migration may not be particularly impacted by the pandemic, we know that the increasing salience of cultural issues like immigration and national identity, they are a factor explaining the success of populist radical right parties. In addition, the choices made by mainstream parties on these topics also play a role for the rise of populism. And I think it is unlikely to say that the overall debate and the narrative on migration in Europe would suddenly take a positive turn. Third, the pandemic introduced more and new uncertainties about the future. These uncertainties, they can open up new discursive opportunities for populism, which is by definition chameleonic, and it adapts to the circumstances in order to exploit the failures of the system, raise criticism of the establishment, and mobilize people's frustrations. An example that illustrates how populists can mobilize these new issues that resonate with the audience is the anti-vax movements, which are being captured and mobilized by populist parties around the world, especially as a way to oppose governments in place and restrictions regarding the COVID-19. And their oppositions, as we've seen lately, their opposition to vaccines and to the new containment measures, they have been framed as a defense of freedom discourse. Then focusing more on the demand side, economic and cultural grievances, as we know, and demands of citizens also help explain the rise of populism. And many of these conditions will likely remain in place even after the pandemic. On the economic side, explanations have focused on how globalization, neoliberalism, technological changes, and others have generated discontent and divisions among the electorate by making life more insecure, and in particular for some underprivileged and more vulnerable groups. Increases in income and wealth inequality have also been linked to rising preferences for populist parties. And as a whole, these economic developments have made many voters resentful and susceptible to populists who scapegoat and vilify elites and the establishment. On the cultural side, the literature has argued that rising fears of migration, the decline of traditional values, and the mobilization of women and minority groups are also major drivers of populism. And this means that the perception of group-based identity threats has led some voters to support politicians that promise to protect their own group status and their own identity. Of course, that these cultural and economic factors, they in reality interact to each other. And in that sense, studies have consistently found that xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments, and out-group resentments tend to rise during difficult economic times. Therefore, considering that the pandemic amplifies uncertainties with regards to unemployment and future job prospects, it is possible that economic insecurity will also intensify sentiments of resentment against out-groups and more attachment to in-groups. And as a final point, populism is also a consequence of what we call the crisis of representation. Over the last years, the electorate has become overall more volatile and the attachments to political parties have drastically decreased. This suggests that the observed rally around the flag effect around parties in government that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, they can well be temporary too. And following the similar reasoning, the assumed lack of trust on populists in power because of the mismanagement of the pandemic could also be sporadic too. So in conclusion, the COVID pandemic does not mean that populism will decrease its force and its popular appeal. What we observe so far are some specific popularity losses in some cases, but the impact of the pandemic is not homogeneous and so far has been, as a rule, very modest. While in the short term, the pandemic has not been capitalized by populists, in the long term, both demand side and supply side factors that explain support for populists will more likely remain in place after the pandemic. As a whole, the prolonged economic crisis can create new conditions and open up new discursive opportunities for populists. And the rising uncertainty can amplify cultural and economic grievances that traditionally help explain the rise of populism. In addition, cultural issues can become salient again in the future. So this does not mean to say that populism will stay the same. It could be that post-COVID populism looks different from what it is now. In fact, in some countries, we have seen emerge new and more radical offers of populism, like in France. Finally, these cases of radicalization raise one important question about the relevance and the level of preciseness of the term populism. And I think this is an important point that has been already raised by scholars of populism. For instance, Casmudo has more often used the term far right rather than populism. But this will, of course, be a topic for another discussion. And so far, the pandemic will leave us with the challenge of populism and with the need to confront to new old questions like these ones about the preciseness of the term of populism. But this is a topic for another debate. Thank you.
We thank you very much, Dr. Aline Burni. Now we have a discussion session. So we are expecting your questions to the two participants, to Aline Burni and Manuel Funke. But here I have some questions to you from the chat part. For example, Leila, she has a question. From past to present, people and minds have been classified as right-wing and left-wing. The successes and failures of both have been seen throughout history. So what can we suggest as a third alternative to these two mentalities that cannot go beyond separatism? In this case, how can we define populist governance? Many thanks. The floor is yours, Aline and Manuel.
If I may, yeah, populism has been suggested already as a third way in between right wing and left wing, or sometimes populists see them interpret their role as being an alternative to both of the mainstream ideology streams, so to say. But as an economist, or the economist profession is not so keen on, or is always after clear classifications. This is why in this paper we simply separate left wing and right wing, because this is the standard approach. But there are many other studies from the political sciences that treat this anti-establishment strategy as a totally different thing than being left-wing or right-wing. So it stands for its own. So yeah, there's some truth in your suggestion that populism can be neither right nor left. It only adapts to, it needs some host ideology to be successful in the political landscape and in campaigns. But in itself, populism is so thin that it in itself, it has no real core ideology besides being against the elite, being against the left wing and against the right wing elite. Yeah, this would be my take. So there was this one question, how do we classify a leader as populist? What features should he have? My answer would be that a populist leader must constantly evoke a conflict between the pure people and the corrupt elite, in the campaign and when in power, and both in actions and in his talk. This would be my answer.
You have another question?
Yeah, and another question was, given a key focus of many populists on lessening inequality, did you examine whether inequality decreased or increased under populists? And my answer is yes, we investigated that. And we found that there's, on balance, like looking at all populists, there's no improvement in the income distribution. But for left-wing populists, especially in Latin America, we see that income inequality slightly decreases. And for right-wing populists, we find no effect. Then there was another question. Did your data actually show a decline in GDP or just a lower level of growth? My answer would be, first of all, I'm not sure what's the difference between a decline in GDP and a lower level of growth is, but I would say we rather find a growth gap. So it is rare that a policy action by a leader, no matter if populist or not, really plunges a country into a mature recession. This is very rare. So what we can only do is we can compare the trends of GDP and then estimate whether there is a gap. So my answer would be just a lower level of growth relative to non-populist countries.
I can tell about this last question. In Turkey, since 2014, it makes about 8 years, there is a net decline in per capita income in USA dollar term, from $13,000 in 2014, from $13,000 to $8,000 during 8 years. That's a drastic fall, really drastic fall.
Interesting.
But I have never seen such a case before in a country.
It is rare. It is rare.
But what is interesting is that Erdogan has still about 40% of political support. That's very interesting. Even more than 40% for the presidential elections.
That is why Erdogan was presented by an expert who is working in the United States of America as the inventor of the 21st century populism.
Yes.
Thanks to his capacity of using a completely different rhetoric based on religion. Right wing and left wing is something different, but he combined both right and left wing populism very successfully, which is never tested somewhere else in the world. I think that success will go to him as an inventor of the 21st century populism.
Thank you. Aline, do we have something to add to this discussion?
Yes. Yeah, I'd like to have a quick take on this question on left, right, and populism. So as it is framed, it sounds like populism would be an alternative to left, right politics, but actually this is the way that populists frame themselves. They claim that they represent an alternative to the establishment, left, right, but actually they also foster and they benefit from divisions. So populists, they claim they are promoting this unity, but actually they promote more divisions, except that it's not in terms of left, right, but in terms of people and the elite. And the thing is that the concept of people is so subjectively defined that they can put anything that they want in this basket. So it's not that populism can be seen as an alternative to left-right politics. First, in this sense, conceptual sense, because this is actually how they claim to be, but they also rely on divisions. And second, because empirically, although by definition, populism as an ideology can be coupled with left or right, in empirically, they are often either coupled with left or right wing ideology as well. It's very rare to find a pure populist case. So even them, they claim to oppose traditional politics and traditional ideologies, but they also hold their own left or right ideologies.
Thank you very much, Aline.
Although I'm going to direct my question to both speakers, but this is a general question, so everybody can contribute. As we know, populist leaders rises against the failures of mainstream politicians, governments. The issue is that in terms of mainstream governments, their performance is measurable. We look at unemployment, we look at cost of living, we look at income distribution data. So these are measurable, observable, but based on those observable outcomes, populist leaders uses some non-observable, non-measurable promises. They use a sort of non-falsifiable, so to speak, in Karl Polanyi's terminology, a non-falsifiable rhetoric. So how to fight against such a perspective? On the one hand, you have to take care of observable, measurable outcomes. On the other hand, you are population, citizens, voters are subject to non-falsifiable, non-observable rhetoric. I think this is a very big challenge and will continue to be like that in the future.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Do we have any answer, Manuel or Aline?
Yeah, maybe I could answer this question on the chat about vaccines and the role of COVAX in bringing countries together. So this is really a speculation, but what I can say is that, so first, the COVAX facility has proven to be still insufficient to address the needs of vaccination, especially in Africa. As we've seen, They are still very underperforming in terms of vaccination, and mainly because of there's lack of vaccines arriving and being effectively distributed there. So this is one thing. I don't think that COVAX has helped bringing countries closer together, because we actually see that they are, through this vaccine diplomacy, we actually see that vaccines are also being donated according to the main interest of donating countries. So we see clearly that the US donates most part of its vaccines to Asia, and Africa is being left behind now because there is less geopolitical interest running there. And the same goes for China and Russia, who have donated vaccines to regions where they have more clear strategic interests. So the COVAX facility is not yet fulfilling its promises, and the vaccine diplomacy is more, I think it's more visible than cooperation and togetherness in this work to provide vaccines everywhere in the world. So you also would like to hear a bit more about any impact on populists. So I can say from the case of Brazil, for example, that we see that Bolsonaro has been a denialist of the virus over the pandemic and very consistent on that. And now he's doing the same for the vaccines. And what we see is that he coupled his vaccine hesitancy with other ideological preferences. So for instance, he particularly opposes the vaccines from China because he doesn't like China, is a left-wing government, and he's a right, Bolsonaro is a far-right populist. So he refuses any alliance or cooperation with China. So since the beginning, however, the Chinese vaccine was the first one that arrived in Brazil. So his government did not take any action to put vaccination campaigns in place, because both the refusal of the Chinese vaccine and the COVID vaccine as a whole. So in general, these new topics, they are being instrumentalized very similarly to the pandemic by populists to foster divisions and identify enemies, rather than being used to really solve the practical problem, right? And just a final comment on that, and Brazil is actually a very interesting case because despite Bolsonaro's denial and the lack of action in promoting vaccination campaigns, the population has been very trustworthy on the vaccines and has promptly answered to the vaccination campaigns taken by regional state authorities and local authorities, and people got vaccinated despite the denialist approach by Bolsonaro. And this can be explained because Brazilians in general, they trust their health system a lot. And I think also because Brazil has been so exposed to the drastic consequences of the spread of the virus. I mean, almost everybody has caught the virus or knows someone who has caught or died from the virus, that this experience itself made people look for and trust the answers, the responses that were becoming available. And this is the case of the vaccination.
Thank you very much, Aline. Gadea Mendez, you have a question. Can you formulate your own question, please?
Sure. I guess this is more for Dr. Manuel Funke, but if you have insight on it, you'd be welcome to answer also, Aline. Thank you for both of your interventions. They were very interesting and informative. I was wondering, because we have seen in your talk that populism leads to worse economic outcomes for countries, and that with its erosions of democratic features, populism has a tendency towards autocracy. And actually in some works like Bozantiano et al., I think in 2021, found that higher levels of democracy have been associated with higher mortality in the pandemic compared to autocracies. So I was wondering if that effect, I guess, assuming that countries that fared better in the pandemic will have better economic results, which is not clear, but if that effect could lead to reducing the economic gap between populist and non-populist regimes, at least during the years close to the pandemic, maybe.
Thank you, Gadea.
Thanks a lot. I'm not sure about this research that you mentioned that democracies have been associated with higher mortality. So honestly, I'm not an expert on the pandemic politics, so to say. But anything that brings liberal democracies closer to autocracies will then also finally lead to the gap between the gap in the economic performance to shrink. That is clear. So I think in the first step, the political economy of the countries entirely changes from a liberal democracy to sort of an autocracy, and then also economic policies will change, and then finally this will have an impact on economic development. But I hope that we won't see this shrinking of this gap, because we've seen it we are seeing it in politics, but I fear that if we also see it in terms of economic development, things will get very worse and very bad in the West. So yeah.
Thank you.
Brett Mayer, you have a question?
Yes, I do. So I have two questions. They're both for Dr. Funke. They're related. The first is, so do you break down populist by substantive ideology? So I mean, like, yeah, a lot of populists may be protectionist, but there was a wave of right-wing populists, especially in Latin America in the 90s, who were, explicitly neoliberal. So I'm wondering if you've broken down populists by types, and also have you looked at inward FDI? Because I think you might get this like opposite movement of these two types of populists. On one hand, you have the left-wing populists and these contemporary cultural populists who, inward FDI investors might be a bit spooked by them. But on the other hand, again, you have the neoliberal populists, who it's going in exactly the opposite direction. They're cultivating these kind of international ties. So I'm just wondering if you've broken this down.
Thanks a lot for your question, and also for the idea, because when I read your question, it made like me. Yeah, it is actually a good idea to take maybe this third group of these right-wing populists that are only right-wing in economic terms, but not so much in cultural terms. So the guys from Latin America in the 90s, and look at them separately when it comes to protectionism. Because from my experience, it is very hard to pin down how populists actually practice protectionism, because there's so many ways of like attracting FDI or not attracting FDI, raising some kinds of whatever import tariffs, taxes, capping exports. There's a range of different policies that are possible, and you can write a 300 pages book only on protectionist measures, so to say, of populists. But yeah, so far we haven't done it, but I think I will definitely follow your idea and try it out. Maybe it is possible then to isolate a true effect. Yeah, thanks a lot. But at the moment I cannot answer your question, unfortunately.
Yes, I think we are approaching to the end of the discussion session. Aline, do you have something to add?
Yes, very quickly to Gadea's point on this paper that showed that democracies had a harder time in terms of limiting the deaths for COVID. I think I read that one, and I was just thinking that, and I think this is considered in the paper, that one reason for this is that of course, autocratic regimes, they can easily just tell people to lock themselves home, and they don't have transparent democratic policy decision-making processes. They don't have to take into account freedoms, personal freedoms, and rule of law and things like that. So it could be that because democracy has to respect these procedures and these kind of liberties and rights, it was harder for them to just take very drastic measures at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Aline. Manuel, do you have some words?
Yeah, because I want to answer to the question by Dr. Öztürk, and that he said that it's difficult to today differentiate between observables or observable truths and some unobservable emotional claims brought up by populists. And I agree that this is a very dangerous situation in which you cannot anymore argue with like a hard scientific fact because you cannot reach the people anymore with this argument. And I don't have a solution for this, but I am not very optimistic that if we go further down that road, moving into this post-facts, post-truths era that is dominated by populists raising irrational emotions instead of facts. This is something that makes me very sad, and that is also why we should keep what we are doing here up and counter those arguments with something that comes from data and facts.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Do you have something to add to this wonderful discussion? One of you? No. Okay. We thank you very much for your very valuable participation to this debate. I think the afternoon session begins at 2:30 p.m. Yes. We thank you very much, especially to Aline and Manuel.
Professor Karakas, we had to postpone afternoon session to 2:30.
2:30, yes.
In order to receive some participants from the United States by considering the time difference. Sorry for this inconvenience, but I wanted to get different perspectives into this symposium. As in the case of Professor Findlay, we got a perspective from Singapore, looking at the situation from the East and West. And now we want to get some other alternative views from the United States. I know this is not convenient so much, but in a global world, we have to do something like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you this afternoon.